Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's SEA program, preparation for the holidays. I'm so happy to be together with you. Just making sure it is recording. It is, okay. I'd like to dedicate our learning today in the memory of Shlomo ben Rivka, in the merit of his deeds. May his loved ones, his wife, his children, and his siblings, and all who knew him be comforted by his loss. I'd like to just take a moment to make a short public announcement. The SEA has been bringing these classes to us for the last few months, and actually for the last few years, but more than ever now through Zoom. I'd like to make an appeal to anybody who's been enjoying the classes. We could very, very much use your support. If anybody would like to make a donation of any size, you could text this number 44321, or you can go on donate.seaupdates.org. Excuse me. Or for those of you who have my number and have any trouble, feel free to side text me and I would let you know how to go about doing it. It's a beautiful way to show our appreciation for all the efforts that are made on our behalf so that we can learn together. So today's class is entitled The Shofar, Hearing the Call. I'd like to start by first referencing how the Torah views the actual sound or how we commemorate the day of Rosh HaShana. It happens to be in Sefer B'Midbar. If you're following with a Chumash, it's chapter 29. In the stone editions, it's page 894. I'm just going to read you the pasuk, and if you don't have a Chumash in front of you, don't worry. I'll be as depictive as possible. It starts with Ubachodesh HaShevi'i, and on the 7th month, Be'echad LaChodesh, on the first day of the month, Mikra Kodesh. This day is going to be a holy festival. Yihiyeh lachem, the Mikra Kodesh yeh lachem, it will be a holy day for you. And Kol Melechet Avodah, and all Melacha, all Avodah, Lo Ta'asu, you will not do. It's a Yom Teruah Yihiyeh Lachem. The day is intended to be a day of Teruah. And the question is, what do those words mean? What is a teruah anyway? What is the sound of a teruah? It's interesting because the Talmud goes into an entire story into trying to figure out what is the sound that we're intended to hear. And it's agreed upon that the sound that we're going to hear is going to come from a shofar, but that's going to be from a horn of an animal. Because we did have chatzotzrot back in the times of the Beit HaMikdash, we did have other musical instruments that could create this sound of teruah, yet they deemed it necessary that it has to come from a crooked horn, a curled, a twirled type of a horn from an animal. And hopefully we're going to discuss all of that as we go through understanding what it is. And I guess I did this research for myself, mostly when I'm in shul and we hear the sound of the shofar. Whoever sits next to me usually asks, are we supposed to be asking for things? Are we supposed to be praying to God? Are we supposed to be asking forgiveness? Are we supposed to be remembering loved ones? What is it that we should be doing? It's definitely an auspicious moment. There's no question about it. Just being in the presence of a live shofar and hearing it blow, it does something to the innards of a person. It clearly, like the Gemara says, will awaken people. It awakens the senses. But I'd like to go through some of the verses so that maybe we can get a more specific sense of what the Torah means when it says this day, it doesn't call it Rosh HaShana. It calls it Yom Teruah, a day for shofar blasts, a day to commemorate these loud blasts. And so we're going to try and discover what does the shofar actually, what ideas does it bring forward for us? So just so we have a little bit of a background, this idea of a teruah, this is not the first that we're hearing of it. In Bamidbar chapter 10, for instance, in verses 5 and 6, we have utkatem teruah venas'u. When you blow a teruah, when the sound of a shofar is blown, it's like a clarion call. It's a sound that is an impetus for the people to travel. So automatically we hear this word teruah, and we start to say to ourselves, there's some type of movement if it's used for traveling. So we know it's clearly used for physical movement, for a physical movement to take place, but at the same time, there was never a physical movement in the Midbar without there having to be a spiritual movement as well. What I mean by that is there would have been no need to travel had the people been in a good place with God. So wherever the Shekhinah felt uncomfortable or felt that the camp wasn't behaving in a way that it wanted to be associated with, the Shekhinah would pick up and leave, the cloud would move, and then we would follow it. So as we start to unpack the pieces of shofar, we see that teruah was used to signify that a movement has to take place, a physical movement, but it always was supposed to come along with some type of change in our attitude. All the packing up of the camps was intended for us to say, I wonder why God's asking us to leave. What needs to be changed on my part? And if you go through the Torah, you'll see every time there's a mishap and the people fall into some type of decline, there's always a travel that takes place after that. So we're starting to put a little bit of a picture around this teruah idea. And as we move forward, if we want to see what the Talmud has to say about it, the Talmud says, of course, we blow a shofar, because the shofar is the way to proclaim a king's sovereignty. It's the way to coronate a king. These shofarot were used in coronations of kings, and on Rosh HaShana, we are recoronating Hashem, Borei Olam, as our king, and therefore it would make sense that we would use a shofar. In this context, when we hear the shofar, we would be in a place of maybe fear or awe. We'd be maybe shaking from the idea that this grand, stern king is going to decide our fate. So that might be an avenue that our minds might go to. We might hear the shofar and say, as we coronate God our king, he's going to decide our fate. Along those lines, the Talmud also says, and you've heard these phrases before, we have them in our prayers, that the sounds of the shofar correlate very much with malchuyot, zichronot, shofarot. Those are the verses that we're supposed to recite before God, verses that coronate him as the king, verses of zichronot, of remembrances, maybe remembering the creation of the world, and shofarot, and hearing these sounds. So we're still not 100% of what it means when we hear this shofar. So there's another beautiful take on the shofar, and they say that we learn which sound specifically we're supposed to, I'll say this, a tekiah is one long uninterrupted blast. The question in the Gemara is, what is a teruah? And there's a whole debate. Is the teruah what we today call shevarim, 3 sounds? Or is the teruah 9 or a bunch of broken sounds all in a row, a string of broken sounds? And the reason that this becomes the debate is because they say that the sound of the teruah is supposed to resemble the sound of a woman crying. And this is what I want to discuss today. The sound of the teruah not only in the Gemara resembles the sound of a crying, sobbing, anguish, worry, anxiety. It's distinctly a woman's cry, and it's more specifically a mother's cry. And the readings that we do on the holiday very much speak to this. So who are the mothers that are crying in the voice of a shofar? And what do these cries encapsulate? So we're going to talk about 3 types of mothers. The first type of mother is the mourning mother. We're going to talk about the most famous mourning mother that they actually speak in the Gemara, that the sound of the shofar should sound like this yevava, like this moaning, groaning anguish of a mourning mother. The woman that they actually use as the example is the mother of Sisra. And this mourning mother becomes the icon for what the shofar should sound like. This is very strange, but I'll tell you the story very quickly. Sisra was the enemy general that the famous Yael killed. You remember he came to her and asked for water. She gave him warm milk. She put him to sleep and she killed him with the peg of her tent. It's a long story for another day, but for today, by Yael killing Sisra, she hands over to Devorah the prophecy victory against the Canaanim. And then there's the big song that Devorah is going to sing because of this victory. In the song that Devorah sings about the defeat of this general Sisra, she describes the scene where Sisra's mother is looking out the window and she's waiting for her warrior son to return with all the booty and with all of the wealth that he has captured from the Israeli people. And she can't imagine why he is so delayed. And the way that the Torah, that it's a story in Shoftim, and in chapter 4, the way that the men, hold on one second, the way that the Torah describes her lament as a yevava, it's very interesting because the commentaries say that her story is told in 101 letters. 101 letters comprise the story of the mother who's lamenting the fact that her son Sephardim, blows. I believe many other communities only have 100 blows, and there's a whole debate on that as well. And part of it, this comes into the story. Do we blow the extra shofar, the extra one to commemorate Sisra's mother or not? But that's not for today's class. Today's class is to say that as much as the shofar is a call for God's coronation, it's also very much a call to hear the voice of the crying mother. We're going to get back to this because otherwise it doesn't make sense. Why would we have a whole day, the first big holiday of the 7th month of the first day, to commemorate our enemy general's mother's cry? So we're going to get back to that a little, but I just want you to know that in the discussion of what the sound of the shofar should be, this woman, the mother of Sisra, comes into play. And so there's the debate is, and we started to talk about this, so I'll talk about it quickly. Is the sound three shevarim? Three shevarim, they say, would three broken, one sound, but it broken in three. That would mostly represent, they say, a person who's worried. Oh, oh, like that. Oh, three like deep breaths and three sounds of, anguish. And those three sounds very much could be resembling a cry, a worry today about something that's going to take place in the future. So Shevarim might start for us to resemble when we're hearing that shofar on Rosh HaShana. It's maybe how the uncertainty within us that is not sure what the future holds, but it's coming with a sense of worry, with a sense of anguish, with a sense of anxiety. The other idea is that I had mentioned earlier, those 9 short blasts. And those 9 short blasts are more reminiscent of a tragedy that already happened. So I'd like to suggest that maybe those broken sounds, that hysteria, that cry, that you can't catch your breath, that you need 8 sounds because you can't stop to even inhale for a minute, that cry might actually be crying for the past, crying for something that once was, something that was lost. And all of a sudden now we are hearing the shofar. I'm not going to leave you. Just don't leave. I'm not going to leave you depressed to thinking that the shofar is only about crying for what might be and crying for what was. Those are part and parcel of what those sounds sound like, but we wouldn't be fair to ourselves if we didn't really get the full picture. So the idea is, just so we know anyway, for your own sakes, when we talk about the women crying, it's not just Sisra who's crying for her general son who doesn't come home. It's Sarah. The commentaries say that she also cried. The reading that we do on the second day of the holiday, we read about the Akedah. And a lot of the commentaries say that Sarah died as a result of believing from Samael, who they say was an incarnation or a representation of Satan, that he told her that her son was actually being sacrificed. And so when we say this idea of this mourning mother, a lot of mourning mothers come into play. We don't just have Sisra's mother, we have Sarah also, who does these bechiyot, who cries. According to the Talmud, she does 3 cries and then another 3 cries. She does bechiyot and yelalot. All of these are sounds that are used in the discussion of what should this teruah even sound like. But the other mother that we may not always pay attention to, and I'd like to give a little attention to her today, is Hagar. And I bring her up in our discussion because she is also included in the reading that we do from the first Torah reading for Rosh HaShana. And for those of you who would like to follow along, it's in chapter 21 in Bereshit. And it's very interesting what Hagar's role is in the sound of the shofar, how she comes to play. So it's chapter 21. I would say if you just looked at verse 16 for the sake of time, at this point, Sarah has already banished Hagar and banished her son, Yishmael. And they have gone into the desert. And by the time we get to verse 15, the water is finished, it's dried up. And Hagar literally is throwing her child by one of the vegetations, the sichim. And then what does she do? She goes and she sits like a bow's arrow distance, and she says, Al er'eh b'mot hayeled. I cannot bear to see my child die or the boy die. Vateshev mineged, and she sits opposite him and she raises her voice. Vatefk. This is the bechi. This is the crying. And the crying of Hagar is something that comes into play for us as well. Vatisa et kola vatefk. You know why she's crying? Because she's imagining the worst case scenario. The child is still alive, but she's already crying as if he died. What's interesting, if we want to just put the two mothers together, Hagar and the mother of Sisera, Sisera's mother actually teaches us a lesson, believe it or not. We could learn something from everybody in Tanach. And that is that when she's worried that her son doesn't return, do you know how she comforts herself? It's not to our benefit because we're the enemy. But she says, and her advisors, her maidens tell her, don't worry, Sisera's probably not back yet because he's so busy collecting all of the booty. He's bringing back 2 women for every man. He's bringing back all of this stuff. And in a crazy way, the mother of Sisera teaches us a very profound lesson. And the profound lesson is, why do you have to imagine the worst case scenario? I know in her case, it actually was the worst case scenario, but she still teaches us that lesson because until she knows for certain, she has a choice of whether to imagine the worst or imagine the best. And she imagines the best, whereas Hagar here starts to imagine the worst. And God comes to her and he tells her, fear not. Right here, Vayishma Elohim et kol hana'ad, and he tells Hagar from the Shamayim, Malach Hagar. It's not just speaking to Hagar. I have to say this. When we read these verses on Rosh HaShana, God is not just saying this to Hagar. We're reading this because God is speaking to us as well through Hagar. And you know what God's saying? Malach Hagar. What's your problem? And by the way, we know the ending. It all ends well. They live happily ever after. Ishmael grows up and becomes a great nation. That is still alive to this very day. And we read this on Rosh HaShana because God is telling us also, Malach, what's the problem? Al tir'i, don't worry. Shama Elohim et kol hana'ad. God hears the prayers. God heard the prayer of your son. And we could talk about those words, ba'asher husham. God is judging who he is at this moment. If at this moment you are sincere, then that's how God is judging us. And all of a sudden we start to get this sense that when we hear the shofar, yes, we're crying out for the past. We're crying out like a mother who has lost her child. We're crying out to God for the terrible things that have befallen us, that has befallen our world this year. Yes, it's okay to cry out for the past year, but never leave in the middle of the shofar blowing. There's a lot of rabbis that will say you must hear every single sound of the shofar of the day. And now I finally understand it. Because if you only hear one set of the cries, one set of the shofar wails, then we might leave cheating ourselves and thinking that the day of Rosh HaShana is about crying for what we've lost in the past. And it's not about that. Because the second set of sounds, the second time, the second set of cries is not going to be the mourning mother. It's going to be the barren mother. And the barren mother, who is most obviously prominent for us here in our Haftarah reading, you can't miss her. Her barrenness is defined as clear as day. I'm talking about Shemuel Aleph, Perek Aleph. If you're following in the blue Chumashim, it's page 1, 2, 3, 4. But I'll read you the few verses just so you could understand who is this Hannah. We know she's the mother of Shmuel. And we know that she starts her story barren. And we know that she has a rival wife who is Penina. And it happens to be, I'll just take you through it for the sake of time, by verse 6, it said that Hashem had closed her womb. And every year she would go up, or her husband would go up to Shiloh, and he would bring her all these choice pieces of meat, vativke velo tochel, but she would cry and she wouldn't eat. And finally, she goes up herself, vehi marat nefesh, and she is in a bad way. But what does she do? She prays to God, ubacho tivke. She cries, and she doesn't just cry, it's a double version of the word cry, bacho tivke. And what does she do? In her bitterness, in her crying out, in her desperation, she ends up giving birth to a prophet. And what does she do? When she goes up there and she makes her deep cry, she makes a promise to God. She bargains with God. She says, God, please, if you give me a son, I will return him to you. I will give him to you to serve you. And the shofar becomes the cry of the barren woman. It's a cry for what could be. What is it really saying? It's saying that the cry of the shofar is saying, the future doesn't seem to be heading in the way that I would like it to head. So my cry is, God, please, I beg you, change the direction of where this is heading. And Hannah's shofar is saying, it's okay to cry for the future. It's okay to cry for your hopes. It's okay to cry for your dreams. And they may yet be possible. Sometimes we don't cry for the dreams that we have because we think that they can't happen. And I'll just tell you that what we read, what we read in the Torah portion about Sarah giving birth, it's that Hashem pakad et Sarah. He made the impossible possible for Sarah, a 90-year-old woman. Excuse me. If a 90-year-old woman could have a child, she can cry and she can have a child, then we too, hearing the shofar, should remind us to say, just like Hannah cried and God delivered, don't give up hope. Cry for your future. Ask for your future. Now, those two might be crying, sad sounds that resemble the shofar, but I would never leave you with that, because the third mother, I see my friend Felicia's here, she's a doula. The third mother, I think you're going to like this, that is referenced with the shofar is the birthing mother. Is the mother who's giving birth. The shofar sounds, the sound that the mother gives when she's going to give birth is very closely related to our Rosh HaShana holiday. How does that work? First of all, the shofar is a very difficult instrument to blow. It's not like they didn't have other instruments at their disposal. They had the silver chatzotzrot, I told you. They had trumpets that had little gold and little silver tips that they were straight horns that you could just blow through them. They had flutes, they had harps, and they had other musical instruments that would much more readily give the sound. But with the shofar, we're never sure that the sound is going to come out. We're never sure it's going to work. We have to take that initial breath, and even the best of the best shofar blowers sometimes find themselves that their air or their ability to push the air through the shofar doesn't catch. And the sound isn't always what you expected it to be. And that's exactly what is the sound of a mother in labor. She doesn't even know what her tiny baby is going to become yet. She is a mother who is we hear the sound, we hear her air, we hear her breath. Some of them are short breaths, some of them are long breaths, but she's in labor because you know why? Because she's resembling the sound of the shofar, because the shofar is what's going to give birth to a whole new world for us. We say Hayom Harat Olam. Today is the day that the world was created, that the world was born, so to speak. We believe that God started the world on the 25th of Elul, but he didn't create man until the 1st of Tishrei, which means that human births came into being. And the person that we could most think of, and I'd rather think of her because I think she's a beautiful, the word shofar sounds like shifra. Shifra and Puah. Remember those midwives in Israel that they helped get the women give birth under the most difficult of situations? Well, the word shifra that sounds like shofar is also from the shefoferet, that she used to blow an instrument like that, make a little sound for the babies, and the instrument that she blew was to be able to help them resuscitate newborns who needed help with breathing. Well, that's what the shofar is for us. The shofar is here to resuscitate us. We went through a year, I don't have to tell you, that really requires a new breath of air to be brought within us. The shofar is the midwife of the entire year. It's going to give birth, not just to the new beginnings that we want to have, but this shofar says, I'm crying out for the present and for the world that is coming into being at this very moment. At the moment of Rosh Hashanah, Hayom Harat Olam, a new world is being born. And with the shofar, with the sound of the shofar, if we have in mind that we too can bring, we're the ones who are able to bring about this new year. Our efforts, every one of us is a laboring mother that is giving birth to a new year. And my prayer is that this new year is going to be filled with all of the blessings, anything that we would wish for the laboring mother to have in her child, that the child should be kind. Let's all be kind to each other, that the child should have wisdom, should have generosity, should have care, should have compassion. And God is our parent. God is Avinu Shebashamayim. So my prayer for all of us is that the sound of the shofar brings back the past, brings the present, but most importantly, creates a future that will be birthed with health, with happiness, with prosperity, and with all the sweetness that we could absolutely use in the upcoming year. I wish you all Chag Sameach, Tizku L'Shanim Rabot, Ne'imot V'Tovot. Thank you for listening. I love you all. And please, if you have a chance and you can take a minute to support the SEA, we can use your help. You can text 44321 or email donate.seaupdates.org. Thank you. Be well. Take care. I think I could unmute you. If anybody has any questions, I know you have other classes that you may need to go to, but if you have any questions, I'm here.
Thank you, Vivien. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vivien.
Vivien,
Wonderful.
thank
Happy
you.
holiday.
Oh, have a great holiday, everybody. Health
You
and health.
too. Thank you.
Thank
Amen.
you,
Amen.
Vivien.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your beautiful things that you're putting in the chat. I'm learning how to read them. It's very nice.
Shavua
Thank you
tov.
so much.
Shavua Tov, and thank you for always joining. And let's hope that we have a beautiful year learning together.
Stay zooming. Stay
Amen.
zooming.
There's a lot of classes. I don't want to keep you. Go see what else is on the schedule and go enjoy
Thank you.
yourselves. Take care. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Viv.
Thank you.
Beautiful.